Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. Our guest today is Robert M Ellis, who is the chair of the Middle Way Society. For anyone unfamiliar with the Society's aims, it is devoted to developing the theory and practice of the Middle Way beyond the limitations of the Buddhist tradition. From this universal perspective, the Middle Way is understood as a principle of judgement that throws us onto experience by avoiding absolutes, both positive and negative. Robert has a PhD in philosophy, which formed the starting point of his work in developing Middle Way thought as an innovative practical philosophy, drawing on various aspects of modern thought. He has produced a series of books on the subject, including the Buddha's Middle Way and the Christian Middle Way, and he's here to talk to us today about the Middle Way philosophy series of books that he's now presently working on. Well, hello again, Robert. Welcome once again to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Thank you, Barry. It's great to be back here again.
Okay, well, I haven't asked you this question for quite a while, but what I normally do with most people who come on the podcast is just ask them to give a bit of background about yourself and how your background has brought you to writing or starting to write this series.
Okay. Where should I start? Well, I suppose there's a professional and cultural background, there's a religious background, there's various kinds of background, but I'll start with religious background actually, just to start somewhere. So I was brought up in a Christian household with a liberal Baptist minister for a father, and then went to university in Cambridge, where I encountered Buddhism first time and got interested in philosophy and in religion of various kinds. And also started studying Indian languages at that point. So from about that period, I got involved in Buddhism and learned how to meditate and things of that kind. But my relationship with Buddhism, specifically with the Triratna Buddhist movement, has been a bit in and out. So I had a phase of involvement there, and then a step away from it, and then another phase of involvement. But so eventually I did become an ordained Buddhist for a few years, which I am no longer. But in the meantime, I started a career as a teacher, got married, things like that. I taught in a sixth form college for a while. And I also taught online. So I got into teaching religious studies and philosophy. And I, in my 30s, I took a career break to do a PhD. And it was the PhD that started me really on the track of Middle Way philosophy and thinking about the Middle Way. So that started really from thinking about the problems of absolutism versus relativism. So it started off as a PhD in ethics, but it turned out, once I started investigating the idea of the Middle Way and how the Middle Way for Buddhism might apply to ethics, it started to tie in lots and lots of other things. So I found that actually I also needed to look at psychology and philosophy of science and history and all sorts of other things. So my PhD, which I did about the turn of the millennium, turned out to be quite a big baggy monster. But it was the beginning of my explorations into the Middle Way. So I did get a PhD out of it, and then gradually, since then, the last 20 years or so, I've been working in one way or another on middle way philosophy, writing books about it. I also exploring the relationship between it and Buddhism, really. So after a while, I decided that I no longer wanted to be a committed Buddhist, because the middle way was more important to me than Buddhism was. I began to make a distinction between the two. So the middle way is as very much as I see as a universal thing. And anyway, so during that period, some of which I've been continued to teach, but during that period, I've been writing books of various kinds. Some of them connected to Buddhism, but others also related to Christianity or to Jung, but some of them also about middle way philosophy in general, so exploring different aspects of philosophy without specifically relating it to a tradition of that kind. So that's where the middle way philosophy, first middle way philosophy series came from. So it started off as it's kind of a detailed expansion, and it was initially kind of a detailed expansion and update of the work I did in my thesis back in 2001. And the first version of it, the first series, as it were, was written between about 2012 and 2015, and was a 4-volume. So that was the first version of the series, and then around about that time also, as you'll be aware, we had the first retreat where we agreed to start the Middle Way Society. So that was 2013. So it began to gather momentum as a thing in itself, as it were. There's the idea of the middle way as something universal, which wasn't just an aspect of Buddhism. So yeah, I've continued to work on that with this new series that obviously I want to talk about in this podcast. After publishing several books with Equinox, I've finally agreed with them to publish a new, much expanded and updated version of the Middle Way philosophy series. But in the meantime, my life has also changed recently because I've moved to Wales to start a retreat centre, which is called Tyrollan House in southern Wales, which I run with my partner. So it's kind of a half Buddhist, half middle way kind of retreat centre setup, because my wife is so involved in Buddhism. Yeah, so that's making quite a long story out of it, but that's an introduction anyway to where I'm coming from.
Okay, well let's get started then. So it's a series of 9 books. You've actually had the first 2 published, and so it'll be interesting before we just unpack it a bit. So how long do you envisage it taking altogether? And then could you just give us a general idea, a general description perhaps of the whole series and how it might have differed from the previous series, and then we can just briefly go through each one just so people get an idea of what entails.
Okay. So the overall aim of the series, I suppose, is to give a more detailed, updated, more effective exposition of middle way philosophy. So particularly of just that there is a middle way. It's an option. That's one of the major messages, because I feel people often neglect it as an option, or simply unaware of it as an option. It does that in a variety of different ways, really, because it's coming at things from different angles. Each volume has a slightly different angle on middle way philosophy, but all those different approaches connect with each other in the end.
Okay.
And obviously another way in which this new series differs from the previous self-published series is simply that it is published by an academic publisher, Equinox, and also so I'm trying to maintain a higher academic standard in the sense of referencing it more fully, for example, and making sure it is as far as possible connected to the current state of understanding of the various topics I touch on or synthesize.
Oh, great. Okay, well, so the first book was published last year. It's entitled Absolutization, the Source of Dogma, Repression and Conflict. So could you tell us a little bit about that book?
Okay, so this is the starting point is identifying the problem. So you could see this as a kind of problem solution structure in the at the beginning of this series. So why do we have a middle way? What's the point of the middle way? Well, the middle way is addressing a particular problem, and that is well, my quick summary of it is very much the assumption that we have the whole story. You can make various quibbles about that quick version of it, but it's a good way, I think, of getting a sense of what it means. So but if you also think about those three elements in the subtitle, so dogma, repression, and conflict, and what they have in common. So it's getting stuck on certain assumptions that we think are the whole story. That tends to lead us into conflict because we are not open to examining through experience the beliefs that we hold. So we're stuck with those beliefs. We absolutize those beliefs. And if we get into conflict, then we're stuck with an absolute view. We want to get rid of the view that we're conflicting with, whether that's the view held by somebody else or a view actually inside us that comes out at a different time. So whether the conflict is psychological or socio-political, we want to eliminate it. So we repress the opposed view.
Okay.
So absolutization is a big problem, particularly because it leads into all kinds of conflict, unnecessary conflict. So not the kind of conflict that's unavoidable because it's part of the system, but the kind of conflict that is due to maladaptation in our lives.
Great. Okay. Just a short question on semantics there. You for a while you used the term metaphysics, but you've replaced it with the term absolutization. Why that shift?
Okay, I mean, I still use the term metaphysics, but in a more specific way. So yeah, it was prone to misunderstanding when I only used the term metaphysics, given that what I was talking about was just as much a psychological phenomenon. So people tended, if they heard the term metaphysics, if they understood it at all, to only engage with it philosophically and assume it was just a philosophical problem. Yeah. But actually, it's a problem that we can see from a variety of different points of view that interact. I mean, I like the Buddha's story of the blind men and the elephant. Yeah. So it was always different people feeling the elephant. They can't see the elephant, but they can feel it from different positions, and they all think that the bit they're feeling is the whole story. So some of them think the elephant is a waste paper basket, some of them think it's a fan, and so on. Yeah. So and I often think that the different subjects, the different academic disciplines feel different bits of the elephant, and when it comes to that kind of what I see as the central issue, which is human judgment, how do we judge things from moment to moment? they have very different views of it, which don't completely connect with each other. So therefore they may have a lot of insight into the problem from one perspective, but it's not connected with the other perspectives.
So
absolutization is a kind of catch-all term, if you like, that attempts to connect them together.
So in many ways, middle way philosophy and your approach is a synthetic one.
That's right, yes, because it's. I mean, that's what I think I have to offer in this, because I'm not a specialist in one particular academic discipline. I don't have an academic post as such, but I'm in a position, I think, to be able to connect together the thinking in these different disciplines and also different traditions. From there's a certain kind of approach to an overview, which has opened up lots of doors, which has connected lots of things for me.
Okay, great. Well, let's move on to the next one. This is also a book that's been published this year, and it's called The 5 Principles of Middle Way Philosophy, Living Experientially in a World of Uncertainty. Would you like to just give us an overview of that?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, The 5 Principles is a much more positive book. So obviously, absolutization is identifying a problem, and it's also, I mean, it begins to look at what the general conditions are for a solution to the problem as well. But the 5 Principles is much more concerned with, okay, what do we do about it? And it's much more practically focused in that sense. So I see it as the central book in the series from that point of view, and the one that's most likely to be relevant to the most people. So what it does is use the 5 principles, which I've kind of developed as a summary of or analysis of what's involved in the middle way as a structure to explain what the practice of the middle way involves. So yeah, there's 5 principles I think tell you sort of distinctively what's involved in the middle way approach, and those are skepticism, provisionality, incrementality, agnosticism, and integration. Okay, so starting with skepticism. Now, a lot of people's associations with the term skepticism are negative. The idea that it's often confused with denial of positions. But skeptical arguments and skeptical questions, as they've been passed down in philosophy, are ways of drawing attention to uncertainty. And uncertainty cuts both ways. So uncertainty is both about positive claims and about negative claims. So it gives no more justification for denying a position than it does for affirming it. So let's take the example of climate change. So people talk about, or used to talk about, climate change skeptics, people who doubted that climate change was a real phenomenon. But that's obviously a misuse of the term skepticism. If skepticism means this set of questions and arguments that can be applied to point out uncertainty. So yes, you can find lots of uncertainty in claims about climate change of any kind, but if you question the positive claims about climate change is happening, always going to happen. If you question that, you should also question the denialism, that is the negative view about it. If you have a dogmatic negative view that climate change definitely isn't happening, regardless of the evidence, then that's a dogma in the other direction. So if you're going to apply skepticism fairly, you need to apply it just as much on both sides. So that's one of the core aspects of the middle way, is trying to be even-handed in the way that you recognize uncertainty and the questions you ask. But it's such a deeply entrenched habit for a lot of people just to assume that that's in some way a negative process. It's not. Yeah, so that leads us on to the second principle, which is provisionality. So if we then think more positively, if we're in a state of uncertainty, then how do we deal with things? How do we judge things positively? And the answer is, well, yes, there's an alternative to absolutization. There's an alternative to dogma, and that is provisionality. That is developing beliefs as appropriate, making judgments as appropriate, but doing so in a way that has taken as much into account as possible in that situation. So particularly considering more than two absolute options. So if you're absolutizing, then very often it's a matter of just applying a yes or a no. This particular way of seeing the situation must be true or it must be false. But if you look more widely at the options, then there's very often a third option, which consists of not accepting the framework of yes and no, or not accepting the true-false framework as it has been expressed, but looking at further back, if you like, looking at the wider context in which the question has arisen. So yeah, to take a very quick example of that, the polarized debates, say, about God, so theism versus atheism, and that's a typical traditional metaphysical polarization. Yeah, so people believe either God exists or he doesn't exist, but in neither case are we in any position to know the truth or falsity of whether there is any kind of infinite being beyond our finite experience. So there's a third option, which is genuine, even-handed agnosticism, and you have to be careful there about what you actually mean by agnosticism. But so being provisional, I think, about that question will lead us on to further possibilities, and that's the basic sort of method, if you like, in the middle way, is thinking where there seems to be a contradiction that can't be resolved. Well, actually, there are other options here, and finding those other options. Obviously, when we're weighing up an empirical issue or scientific or moral issue or something of that kind, then we need to go through a process of weighing up the strength of the evidence and the experience available to us. But if it's something that's involves an absolute opposition, then we have to stop questioning that absolute opposition and the assumptions that have been made to produce it. So then the third principle is incrementality. So that's another skill that's helpful, I think, to overcome absolutization, because absolutes always involve something either being true or not, there being a discontinuity between one thing and another, between it being so or it not being so. So if we can think incrementally about any thing or any quality, or what a person is like, for example, the attributes we apply to a person, then we are able to more easily able to overcome our prejudiced assumptions or our biased assumptions about them. So so incrementality is another kind of tool in the toolbox. Then agnosticism is obviously implicit in some ways in skepticism and provisionality, as I've already mentioned them, but I see it specifically as a kind of it's a slightly defensive principle. So it's a matter of finding ways of avoiding getting sucked into a polarized binary conflict between groups, particularly. So if you imagine yourself in a debate between theists and atheists, for example, or between socialists and conservatives, or some other polarized groups against each other, then very often it's very difficult to raise a third point of view in kind of context. And if you try to do that, very often you will find your view is either appropriated into one side or lumped into the other side. You're assumed to be on the other side or on their side, because that polarization, that duality is so strong. So agnosticism is like a series of skills or strategies, if you like, I think, for remaining in that middle zone, for insisting actually, well, I'm going to think about this in a wider way. I'm not going to get sucked into your conflict. And that's quite difficult, just because of the pressure, the social pressure that we get from those opposed views.
And just briefly, you also make a distinction between soft agnosticism and hard agnosticism. Could you just explain that briefly? That one you could get caught.
Yeah, I mean that's not my distinction, but it's a way in which I think agnosticism is often misunderstood. I mean, soft agnosticism is this particularly relates to beliefs about God usually. Soft agnosticism is not believing either way, but expecting further evidence in the future, which will give you a decisive answer either way. So in the case of God, either that God exists or he doesn't. Whereas hard agnosticism is recognizing that you're not going to get that information, you're not going to be able to get confirmation that it's true or false. So the way that's been labeled, hard and soft, or sometimes strong and weak, it kind of loads it kind of fingers agnostics as being dogmatic, or in some way if they recognize uncertainty in a thorough fashion. But I think it should be the other way around, that so it's the people who expect a resolution of some kind that are being unrealistic and are not really recognized what agnosticism involves.
Okay.
If you expect to know at any point, as a finite being, if you expect information about infinity, about an infinite claim of any kind, then you're going to be waiting for an infinite length of time to get that information. It's realistically, it's not going to happen to you as an embodied creature. You need to come to terms with that. So call that hard agnosticism, but I don't think it's a dogmatic position. It's a realistic position of what it's like to be embodied.
Great. Okay, the next one is integration. Integration,
yeah, is the final principle. So that's where all the underlying psychological states come in, and their relationship with the philosophical beliefs and the philosophical balancing, if you like, of the middle way. So if we hold on to an absolutized belief, as I already mentioned, that tends to lead to conflict. But if we can avoid those absolutized beliefs, then we have a chance of integrating conflicting beliefs of all kinds, again, whether they're within us or outside us. And integrative practice, I think, can do a lot to help create the conditions where we can practice the middle way. And that's where a whole range of practices can come into focus as being an aspect of the middle way. So meditation is a good example of a practice that can help us fairly immediately to calm down unnecessary polarization in our beliefs, in our experience, in our states of mind, and allow a more experiential, more justified beliefs to emerge. But that may be short-lived in its effects. But there are also longer-term ways of working. So critical thinking is, I think, a crucial practice which can be found in all sorts of other generally more intellectual forms of ways of practicing. And then there's also meaning and the imagination, which is where the arts come in as an important aspect of integrative practice. So they provide new options. They allow us to imagine new options so that we can, to help us break out of the rigid assumption that there is only this way of seeing things, this absolutized way of seeing things, and its opposition.
So the third one is a systemic history of the middle way, the biology, developmental psychology, and cultural change behind integrative practice.
Yeah, so that third volume in the series is due out in 2024, probably middle of 2024 now, and it's doing something I haven't tried to do before in any of my writings, really, which is to look at the historical, in a broad sense, historical aspects of the middle way. So what kind of conditions have given rise to the necessity of the middle way, the practical necessity of the middle way? What kind of conditions have given rise to absolutization as the problem for us? So I've tried to explore that without, the trap, I think, in writing about history of any kind is always appealing to it in some way, or say in some way claiming this is true because this person said it was, or because of these historical events. But what I'm just trying to do is really help to develop understanding of the context for those who are interested, out of which the middle ways have arisen. So that's first of all a biological context. How have human beings evolved into creatures that are prone to absolutization and need the middle way? And then, well, how does that affect us individually as we grow up and lead our lives? How does the middle way? How is the middle way applied at different stages during our life, and how does the need for specific practice of the middle way link into or take off from the ways in which we, as it were, naturally mature anyway? So how can we draw any kind of line between maturation and practice, as it were?
Okay, just a question. Looking at the biology of humans and our history, have you thought about whether any other animals are prone to absolutization?
Well, that's something I've definitely addressed in the first section of this book. It all starts with feedback loops, I think, and so reinforcing feedback loops and balancing feedback loops. So for a reinforcing feedback loop is where some kind of process feeds itself in a way that becomes less and less well adapted to its environment. So if you think of just a simple physical version of that, is something like, let's say people talking at a party. Yeah, so the more noise there is, the louder people talk, and the louder people talk, the more noise there is. So this is a self-feeding, accelerating process, a reinforcing feedback loop. Then the balancing process would be if somebody realized this was happening, they became aware of it and started to actually reduce their voices or in some way make it easier to be quiet. So that's been going on since the beginning of life. You could say that life itself is a kind of reinforcing feedback loop. Every organism wants to carry on being alive and to feed itself and reproduce. But there's a point where reinforcing feedback loops turn into absolutization. So they take a specific form of assuming that you have the whole story in your judgments. And that obviously requires you to have some degree of you need to be able to make representations in judgment, or at least believe that you are representing the world in some way in your judgments, so that you can believe that they are true or false. So that's appears to be a distinctively human thing, but where the dividing line actually is obviously very difficult to determine. But you could certainly make a case for more intelligent animals having some kind of absolutization or being prone to it in some ways. If you think of a neurotic dog, for example, that gets stuck in a particular way of behaving, maybe if it became aware in some other new ways, it perhaps be able to work its way out of its rut. So there's a kind of proto middle way there, possibly. But it certainly more clearly applies to humans, I think.
Well, you sometimes give the example of rats and pandas, that a panda is very dependent on one source of food for its existence, and if that source goes, then the panda will go, in a sense. Whereas a rat has lots of optionality, I think is the terms you use. So it can respond a lot better to changes in its environment.
Yeah, I mean, that's a wider illustration of the concept of adaptivity and optionality.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's an aspect of how we can follow the middle way by finding more options, particular point. So, but in the systemic history, there's that process of reinforcing feedback loops and balancing feedback loops as it's appeared in evolution. But probably the most important thing that seems to have created the need for the middle way in humans during that process of evolution has been brain lateralization. So the process by which humans tended to have, they've developed parts of their brains which tends to be over dominant, particularly the left prefrontal cortex, but generally also the left hemisphere in general, as we see in the work of Ian McGilchrist. So that potential to absolutize and get stuck, as it were, seems to have developed from that capacity for the left hemisphere to be over dominant. And that goes back to, the beginning of brain lateralization seems to have occurred in early fish. So it's shared with nearly all other animals, at least up the evolutionary tree from that point. But to have become particularly pronounced in humans, or maybe humans and other primates particularly, but basically the bigger your brain, the more danger there is of over left hemisphere dominance. That's the explanation McGilchrist gives, which I find quite helpful. So the number of links in a more complex brain increases exponentially. So our brains have become so much more complex than those of the preceding animals in the evolutionary tree. So at the same time, that's increased the capacity of each of the hemispheres to operate independently, and the need also for them to be able to repress each other, particularly for the left to repress the right, so that it can operate when necessary. So that's a bit of a byway, but it's an example of an interesting kind of explanatory aspect of how did this situation where we need the middle way arise? Well, the major biological need for it seems to have come from brain lateralization, particularly. Okay, so shall we move on to the next book?
Yeah. So this one is have you started this one yet?
Yes, I'm writing the next one. Yeah.
Okay, so this is Embodied Meaning and Integration, Overcoming the Abstracted Grip on Meaning in Theory and Practice.
Okay, so this is, to start with, making clear one of the major elements of the middle way philosophy approach that I think is pretty important, and that's embodied meaning. Particularly, I suppose, putting forward an interpretation of embodied meaning in relation to the middle way, and also showing its interrelationship with the idea of the integration of meaning, integration in general. So, yeah, I mean, embodied meaning is a whole new way of thinking about things, I think, which has come particularly since the 1980s and the work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. It's since been taken up by many other people in different ways, in a certain area of academia. So people tend to talk about 4E cognition. But in many ways, I think the more recent work on it seems to me to have missed some of the point, in that although it's developed an understanding of embodied meaning in all sorts of ways, it's not really taken on board just quite how different a view it suggests to how we can make judgments and live our lives. And the main reason I say that is particularly, well, the relationship between getting stuck or absolutization and believing that we have the whole story, and believing that our language can tell the whole story. So believing that the whole way in which meaning works for us is one that can take the form of, sentences in words, and those sentences tell you the truth or the falsehood. So therefore you can continue to rationalize or justify your obsession, as it were, with the absolute truth or falsity of these sets of words. So for a long time, there's been both an academic and a popular view that meaning comes from a relationship of some kind with reality. It could be a hypothetical relationship in the philosophical version, the truth conditional theory of meaning, but there's also a more popular version. But loads of evidence really points to a quite different interpretation of what meaning is, and that's that it comes from our experience of linking or associating symbols of various kinds with our experience, and indeed linking experiences together. So every time our brain makes new links, meaning increases, in a sense. And our imagination develops, our capacity to think in different ways develops. But obviously an important way of doing that is to do it via symbols, to use symbols to be associated with particular kinds of experiences. So embodied meaning theory explains how even our incredibly complex propositional language, say an academic textbook or something like that, even all the words in that can be understood as meaningful because ultimately of their relationship with the body and the things we've done with our bodies, the associations we have made, rather than because these words match this reality. So if we can sort of understand that view and take it on board, I think that takes us an incredible long way, or can take us an incredible long way in understanding the middle way perspective.
So if someone had, for example, an experience of God, let's say, and that and that for them is a very meaningful and potentially inspiring experience. They could see the God as an archetype that can, this an integrated person, that someone to aspire to. That's something that would be very much in accordance with this idea of meaning, as long as the person doesn't then say, because of that experience, therefore God exists.
Yeah. So the distinction between meaning and belief, I think, is very important there, and can help us to make sense of the issue of how to deal with this tradition about God. So it can be meaningful to us without us necessarily having to develop beliefs of particular kind, particularly when it's an infinite thing like God. Traditionally, people have taken beliefs, first of all, such as beliefs in God existence, or belief that God sent Jesus as his only begotten Son, and so on. Taken those beliefs and taken those as the basis of the meaning of God. But it's quite possible to understand the meaning of God in relation to our experience. First of all, our experience obviously includes all kinds of cultural and artistic, say, aspects to it, but includes religious traditions, but it doesn't have to be held hostage, as it were, by the formal theology, the beliefs about God.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just thinking of another example here. You've just been on holiday to Italy, and I know you have a particular interest in religious Renaissance art, and you've just spent, I think, about a week there. So in this framework, how would you describe that experience?
The experience of Renaissance art? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that this is it's all about meaning. Yeah. So supposing I look at a picture of the Annunciation, so that's a particularly meaningful thing for me. Is the it's on the cover of one of my books. Is so the angel Gabriel announcing to Mary. But obviously, you could view that through traditional Christian beliefs about what that means about the Mary's virginity, for example, and Jesus being really God, but then entering human form and all, and that being intended to save humankind and all that stuff. But the meaning of the scene itself, the meaning of the Annunciation, is a much more direct thing, I think. If you look at the wide variety of scenes and what particularly Renaissance painters are probably trying to communicate through them quite often, it's you get sometimes the bewilderment of Mary, that there's this incredibly weird thing going on. Yeah, what's this? Me? And you get the angel as this surprising communication from another perspective that's beyond what she's previously understood. So it's all about a bigger context that you haven't recognized before, somehow coming in on you, and then you realizing, well, actually this is about something inside me. So that this potential, this gobsmacking heavenly thing that's actually is inside me, and I'm then could do something, have a creative involvement in that process. So I'm as different from the Virgin Mary as anyone, really, but I'm human and she's human, and so we have all those potentials in common.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, there's another 5 books which you haven't started yet, so maybe you could just give us a brief overview of those, Robert. So the next one is Bias and the Integration of Belief, The Psychology of Absolutized Judgment and the Middle Way.
Okay, yeah. So obviously the plan there is to discuss the issue of bias and how the issue of bias relates to the practice of the middle way. So particularly that we don't have to be deceived by bias. We don't have to make excuses for it. So there are ways of working with bias. So there'll be quite a lot of psychology and discussion of how we justify our beliefs in relation to the psychology of cognitive psychology.
Okay, and then the next one is the practice of agnosticism, overcoming false dualities across human thought. Well, we've spoken about agnosticism already, but you go into in much greater detail here, yeah?
That's right, yes. So that's where discussion will be more detailed discussion of different kinds of metaphysical polarized views. Yeah, so engaging with the philosophies about those beliefs. So if you take theism and atheism, I already mentioned, yeah. Free will and determinism is another really important one, or idealism and realism. So there are a variety of opposed metaphysical beliefs like that have far more influence than people generally recognize, perhaps because they assume one or another of these poles in the way that they think about things. So if you take the example of criminality, either the criminal freely did it or they didn't, either they were responsible or they weren't. So issues like that will, I'll be discussing how we can actually find a middle way in all those traditional polarized views.
Okay, that sounds interesting. And the next one is mindful beauty, aesthetics as gathering attention.
Okay, yeah. So that's particularly looking at how do we relate embodied meaning and the middle way to beauty and our judgments about beauty and art. And very briefly, my view of this is that there's more than one kind of beauty. There are different ways that things can be beautiful, but what they have in common is that they gather our attention, grab our attention, and they temporarily unify our attention. So hopefully that book can help to explain how an appreciation of beauty and art of that kind can help us in the practice of the middle way, and how aesthetics do link into things like ethics and other levels of practice, if you like.
Okay, and then middle way ethics, stretching across the gap between relative and absolute values.
Yeah, so I think that's going to be an important book as well. So trying to explain how middle way can be applied to ethics, and so particularly there the idea of stretch is there in the subtitle. Yeah, so the idea that it's not just a question of finding what's right or what's wrong, but rather of first of all understanding where we are and then how we can stretch ourselves in the right direction, as it were. So to a slightly bigger, more contextualized view of things, and how we can help develop the conditions for that. So if we apply that perspective to all sorts of issues, that's what I'll be doing in the book, across the different ethical concerns.
Okay, and the last one is the Middle Way Manifesto, combining radical change with political effectiveness.
Yeah, so that's the political book, and I've long had an interest in political philosophy and so on, but I really think the middle way is applicable to politics and needs to be applicable to politics. It's not an apolitical thing. But it's not just a simple adoption of an ideology. It's not just an ideology in the normal sense. It's a way of judging and a way of approaching, again, starting from where we are and stretching so it's an application of middle way ethics in the horrendously polarized world of political conflict and political issues. So how do we navigate through that, making the best of who we are, trying to develop our capacities, if you like, to deal with it, so as to do all the things we want to do through politics, which is, for instance, to save the planet, or to maybe save our country, or whatever, from whatever difficulties we're finding in it.
Great. Well, thank you very much for talking to me today, Robert. I hope you managed to get the sense of what you're trying to do in this series across.
Thank you very much. It's great to talk about it.
You can find out more about middle way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.